There's a photograph that hangs in the Pendleton family manor in rural Virginia. It shows a bride in white lace, her face pale as porcelain, standing beside a groom whose features seem to blur. When you look directly at them, the date on the back reads 1893. Her name was Clara Pendleton. She was 14 years old, and according to every record, every witness account, every piece of testimony gathered over the next century, no one could ever remember meeting her husband before the wedding day. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. For over 150 years, every firstborn daughter in the Pendleton family married at 14, every single one, and every single groom was a stranger, a man who appeared, performed the ceremony, consummated the marriage, and then existed in the house, in the town, in photographs. But when you ask anyone, neighbors, friends, even the girl's own siblings to describe him, their eyes would go distant. Their words would falter. They'd say things like, "Oh, yes, of course I know him," but they could never tell you his name. They could never tell you where he came from. They could never tell you what he looked like. The Pendleton daughters never spoke of their marriages, not to their mothers, not to their sisters, not in diaries, not in letters, not even on their deathbeds. And by the time each girl turned 15, she would be pregnant. By 16, she'd given birth to another daughter, and the cycle would continue. This is not folklore. This is documented history buried in courthouse records, census data, and family Bibles that no one wanted to open. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. My name is not important. What matters is what I found. I spent 3 years tracking this family across Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky. I spoke to descendants who refused to give their full names. I read letters that were never meant to be preserved, and I discovered something that American history tried very hard to forget. Sometimes the most terrifying curses are the ones we call tradition. This is the story of the Pendleton daughters and the men who married them. The Pendleton family arrived in Virginia in 1768. They were wealthy, educated, and respected merchants who'd made their fortune in tobacco and textiles. The patriarch, Nathaniel Pendleton, built a sprawling estate just outside what would become Charlottesville. He had 3 sons and 1 daughter. Her name was Margaret. She was his eldest child. In 1782, when Margaret turned 14, the family announced her engagement. The wedding was held on the autumn equinox, September 22nd. Over 100 guests attended. They ate roasted duck and drank imported wine. They danced until midnight. And every single person who was there remembered the bride. They remembered her dress, her flowers, the way she stood so still during the vows that someone thought she might faint. But when historians interviewed descendants of those guests in the 1970s, not one could describe the groom. His name appeared in the family Bible as Thomas. No surname, no birthplace, no parents listed. Margaret's younger sister, Elizabeth, wrote in a letter to a cousin that she found Thomas perfectly pleasant. But when pressed for details, she wrote only, "He has a kind face, I think, or perhaps, I only imagine it must be kind, as Margaret seems content." The letter, now housed in the Virginia Historical Society, ends abruptly. The ink smudged as though Elizabeth had set it down and never returned to finish it. Margaret gave birth to a daughter. 10 months later, they named her Abigail. Margaret lived to be 73 years old. In all those years, Thomas remained by her side. He appears in census records. He's listed as head of household. His occupation is marked as landowner, but there are no tax records in his name, no property deeds, no legal documents of any kind bearing his signature except the marriage certificate. When Margaret died in 1855, Thomas did not attend her funeral. He simply wasn't there anymore. Her children couldn't recall when they'd last seen him. One granddaughter would later write in her memoir that she remembered playing in her grandmother's house as a child and sensing that there was a man in the study, but she could never quite bring herself to knock on the door. Abigail Pendleton turned 14 in 1797. On September 22nd of that year, she married a man named Jonathan. Again, no surname. Again, a wedding with hundreds of witnesses. Again, a groom no one could describe. Abigail's own mother, Margaret, attended the ceremony. She stood beside her daughter and watched her marry a stranger. And when asked about it years later by a visiting minister who was compiling family histories, Margaret said only, "It is our way. It has always been our way, but it hadn't always been their way, because before 1782, there was no pattern. Nathaniel Pendleton's own wife had married at 20, his mother at 19. This started with Margaret, with that first wedding, with that first groom. Something changed in the Pendleton family in 1782, and whatever it was, it didn't end with Margaret. By 1823, the pattern had repeated itself 3 more times, each firstborn daughter, each wedding on September 22nd, each groom a phantom in the memory of everyone who met him. But it was Catherine Pendleton, born in 1809, who left behind the first real clue that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Catherine kept a diary. Most of it is mundane descriptions of needlework, complaints about the heat, observations about her younger brothers, but the entries stop abruptly on September 20th, 1823, 2 days before her 14th birthday, 2 days before her wedding. The next entry is dated for months later, January of 1824, and it contains only one line written in handwriting so shaky it barely looks like hers. I understand now why Mother never speaks of it. That's all. The rest of the diary is blank, 300 pages of empty paper. Catherine would live another 56 years. She never wrote another word. Her daughter Eleanor would later tell a family friend that her mother had a habit of staring at doorways, not through them, at them, as though she expected something to step across the threshold that she desperately didn't want to see. Eleanor said her mother would sometimes wake in the night and walk through every room of the house, checking that all the doors were locked from the inside, even the door to her own bedroom, especially the door to her own bedroom. Catherine's husband, recorded in the family Bible as William, appears in a single drape taken in 1850. He's standing behind Catherine and their 3 children, or rather, there's a shape standing behind them. The image is badly degraded, but you can make out a dark suit, a hand resting on Catherine's shoulder. Where his face should be, there's only a white blur. Photographic experts have examined the image. They say it's not damage, it's not a development error. The blur was there when the photo was taken. As though the camera couldn't quite capture him, Eleanor Pendleton married in 1837. September 22nd, age 14. Her groom's name, according to the certificate, was Michael. Her younger sister, Grace, was a bridesmaid. Grace kept meticulous records of everything: household expenses, weather patterns, her children's heights at every birthday. She recorded Eleanor's wedding in her ledger with a single note: "Eleanor wed today. I wish I could feel happy for her." 3 weeks after the wedding, Grace tried to visit her sister. The house was locked. She knocked for 20 minutes. She could hear movement inside, footsteps, the scrape of a chair, someone breathing on the other side of the door, but no one answered. Grace wrote in her ledger, "Eleanor would not open the door. I heard her voice. She said, 'Please go.' I'm not allowed. I asked, 'Who wouldn't allow it?' She didn't answer. I heard a man's voice say something I couldn't make out. Then silence." Grace never saw her sister alone again, not once in 43 years. This was the reality for the Pendleton daughters. Marriage at 14 wasn't just tradition. It was isolation. It was erasure. These girls were handed over to men whose very existence seemed to resist being known, being remembered, being seen. And the daughters who lived through it never warned the ones who came after. They never broke the silence. They never said, "Run." By the late 1800s, the Pendleton family had become something of a local legend in their corner of Virginia. But the legend wasn't about the marriages. It was about the wealth. The family never seemed to lose money. Crops never failed on Pendleton land. Their businesses never collapsed, even during the financial panics that devastated their neighbors. When the Civil War tore through Virginia and left entire counties in ruins, the Pendleton estate emerged untouched. Not a single building burned, not a single field trampled. Both Union and Confederate soldiers passed through the area, and somehow neither side ever requisitioned the property. A Confederate officer's diary from 1863 mentions riding past the Pendleton Manor at dusk. He wrote, "Saw the great house on the hill, meant to stop for water and shelter, but the men refused to approach. When I asked why, they said the place felt wrong, like we weren't welcome, like we were being watched by something that wasn't quite human. I felt it, too. God help me, we wrote on. The townspeople noticed, of course. They noticed that Pendleton daughters disappeared into their marriages and rarely came out. They noticed the strange, forgettable men who appeared every generation like clockwork. But whenever someone tried to ask questions, something peculiar happened. They'd forget what they were asking about. Not immediately, but within a day or two. The curiosity would just fade. In 1903, a journalist from Richmond arrived in town to write a feature story about old Virginia families. She'd heard rumors about the Pendletons and wanted to investigate. Her name was Adelaide Morris. She checked into the local inn and spent 3 days interviewing townspeople. Her notes, discovered decades later in a trunk in her sister's attic, show that she was building a case. She'd found census records showing the pattern. She'd identified at least 7 generations of 14-year-old brides. She'd interviewed a woman who claimed her grandmother had been a Pendleton servant and had seen things in that house that no Christian should witness. On her 4th day in town, Adelaide went to the Pendleton estate to request an interview. She never came back to the inn. Her belongings were still in her room. Her notes were hidden under the mattress as though she'd been afraid someone might find them. A week later, Adelaide Morris returned to Richmond. Her editor asked about the story. According to his correspondence, Adelaide looked at him blankly and said, "What story? I just took a week's holiday in the country. Nothing worth writing about." She had no memory of her investigation, no memory of her notes. When her sister tried to show her the trunk years later, Adelaide refused to look inside. She said it gave her a headache just thinking about it. The town maintained its silence. Neighbors brought pies to the Pendleton house when a new daughter was born. They attended the weddings every September 22nd. They saw the strange, blurred men standing at the altar, and then they went home and forgot to feel disturbed. This wasn't just a family secret. It was a collective amnesia that seemed to spread like fog over anyone who got too close to the truth. But some things can't stay buried forever, because in 1947, something went wrong. Her name was Virginia Pendleton. Born in 1933, the eldest daughter of Rebecca Pendleton, and the man Rebecca had married in 1919, a man whose name appeared in records as David and whom neighbors described as pleasant enough, though none could recall ever having a conversation with him. Virginia was different from her ancestors. She asked questions. She read everything she could find about her family history, and when she turned 13 in 1946, she went into the attic and found the wedding portraits, row after row of pale girls in white dresses standing beside, grooms whose faces seemed to slide out of focus when you try to look at them directly. She found her mother's portrait, her grandmother's, her great-grandmother's, all the way back to Margaret in 1782. Virginia's mother found her there sitting on the dusty floor, surrounded by photographs, according to a letter Virginia later wrote to her cousin. Her mother didn't scold her. She didn't tell her to put them away. She just sat down beside her daughter and said very quietly, "It's not as terrible as you think it will be. You get used to it." Virginia asked what she meant. Her mother wouldn't elaborate. But that night, Virginia heard her parents arguing, or rather, she heard her mother's voice pleading. The other voice, her father's, presumably was so low and strange that Virginia couldn't make out words, only a sound like wind through a tunnel. Her mother was crying. She kept saying, "She's just a child. Please, just a little more time." The next morning, Virginia's father was gone, not dead, not moved away, just absent in a way that made the house feel larger and colder. Her mother wouldn't speak about it, but September 22nd was 11 months away, and Virginia understood with absolute certainty that if she stayed, she would stand at an altar and marry something that were the shape of a man. So she ran. On a February morning in 1947, Virginia Pendleton took her grandmother's jewelry, $70 from the household money, and a bus ticket to Baltimore. She left a note that said only, "I'm sorry, I can't. Please don't look for me." The Pendleton family did not report her missing. They did not hire investigators. They did not call the police. They simply waited. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Virginia made it as far as Baltimore. She found work in a department store. She rented a room in a boarding house under a false name. She told people her parents were dead. For 7 months, she believed she was free. She wrote letters to her cousin Sarah, letters she never mailed, but kept hidden under her bed. In them she described nightmares, dreams where she was back in the Pendleton house, standing in a room with no doors and something was breathing behind her. She wrote, "I keep seeing him in crowds, the man I was supposed to marry, except it's never the same face. It's every face. I think he's looking for me." On September 22, 1947, Virginia Pendleton was found unconscious in her boarding house room. The door had been locked from the inside. The window was sealed. There was no sign of forced entry. But when her landlady broke down the door, Virginia was lying on the floor in a white dress no one had ever seen before. A wedding dress, and on her finger was a ring. She was taken to a hospital. When she woke 3 days later, she had no memory of how she'd gotten there, no memory of the dress. But she knew with the certainty of someone who'd lost a battle they'd been fighting alone, that she had to go home. Virginia Pendleton returned to the family estate in October of 1947. She never tried to leave again. Virginia gave birth to a daughter in June of 1948. They named her Alice, and for the first time in Pendleton family history, someone broke the silence. In 1961, when Alice was 12 years old, Virginia sat her daughter down and told her everything. She told her about the pattern, about the marriages, about the grooms no one could remember. She told her about running away and waking up in a wedding dress with no memory of how it got there. And she told her daughter something that no Pendleton woman had ever said out loud before. "You don't have to do this. We can fight it together." Virginia hired a lawyer. She tried to file papers that would legally emancipate Alice before her 14th birthday. The lawyer took the case, drew up the documents, and then inexplicably never filed them. When Virginia called his office, he claimed he had no record of ever meeting her. His secretary found the documents in his filing cabinet 3 weeks later. They'd been shredded. Virginia tried again. She contacted a priest, begging him to help break what she called a contract made by our ancestors. The priest agreed to meet with the family. He arrived at the Pendleton estate on a Saturday afternoon in August of 1962. He entered the house. Neighbors saw him walk through the front door. He was never seen leaving. The church reported him missing. Police searched the property with the family's permission and found nothing, nobody, no signs of violence, just an empty house with too many rooms and a family who insisted he'd left after an hour. And they had no idea where he'd gone. The police didn't pursue it. Later, the lead investigator would tell a reporter that he'd felt strongly they should drop the case, though he couldn't explain why. He said, "Every time I tried to write my report, I'd forget what I was writing about. Like my mind just slid off the subject." Alice's 14th birthday was September 15, 1962. The wedding was scheduled, as always, for September 22nd. Virginia spent those 7 days in a state of desperate, frantic action. She tried to drive Alice out of state. The car broke down 3 times in 3 miles. She tried to hide her daughter in the cellar. Alice sleepwalked back to her bedroom. She tried to board up the house to keep whatever was coming from getting in. On the morning of September 22nd, Virginia woke to find her daughter already dressed in white, a seamstress in town, who later claimed she had no memory of making the dress, had delivered it during the night. Alice was standing in the parlor, perfectly still, her eyes open but distant, and beside her stood a man. Virginia never described what he looked like. In the one interview she gave years later to a folklorist studying Appalachian family traditions, she would only say, "He looked like a husband, like any husband, like the idea of a husband. But when I tried to see his face, really see it, my eyes hurt, like staring at the Sunday." The wedding took place in the Pendleton family chapel. 37 guests attended. Every single one of them remembered Alice. Not one could describe the groom. The marriage certificate listed his name as Robert. No surname, no birthplace, no witnesses who could verify his identity. Alice gave birth to a daughter in July of 1963. They named her Charlotte. And when Virginia held her granddaughter for the first time, she wept because she knew 14 years was all Charlotte would have. 14 years of childhood, of innocence, of freedom. And then the cycle would begin again. Virginia Pendleton died in 1991. In her final weeks, delirious with fever, she kept repeating the same phrase, "We made a deal. Someone made a deal, and we keep paying for it." Charlotte Pendleton married in 1977. September 22nd, age 14. By then, the world had changed. Child marriage was illegal in Virginia. Social services existed. Mandatory education laws were enforced. And yet, somehow the wedding happened anyway. The certificate was filed. The officials who should have intervened simply didn't. A county clerk later said she remembered processing the paperwork and thinking it seemed fine when shown the birth certificate proving Charlotte was 14. She stared at it in confusion and said, "That can't be right. I would never have approved that." But she had, just like every clerk, every judge, every witness for nearly 100 years had approved it, because the Pendleton marriages existed in a blind spot, a place where scrutiny slid away like water off glass. I found Charlotte in 2021. She's 63 years old now. She lives alone in a small house in Kentucky, far from the family estate. Her daughter, a woman named Elizabeth, born in 1978, cut off all contact with her mother 20 years ago. Charlotte wouldn't tell me why. She would only say she got out. That's all that matters. I asked Charlotte if she remembered her wedding day. She said yes. I asked her to describe her husband. She stared at me for a long moment, and then she said, "I've been married for 40 years. I see him every day, and I couldn't tell you what color his eyes are. I couldn't tell you his favorite food. I couldn't tell you a single story about his childhood, because he's never told me one. Or maybe he has, and I just can't remember." She showed me a photo album, pictures of holidays, birthdays, ordinary moments. In every single photograph that should have included her husband, there's a figure, a shape, a presence, but your eyes won't focus on it. It's like trying to look at something in your peripheral vision that vanishes when you turn your head. I asked Charlotte the question I'd been trying to answer for 3 years. What are they? These husbands, these men who aren't quite men. She smiled. It was the saddest smile I've ever seen. "I don't know," she said. "My mother thought they were demons. My grandmother thought they were punishment for something our ancestor did. Me? I think they're exactly what they appear to be. Husbands, just from somewhere else, somewhere that doesn't work the way our world does. And whatever deal was made in 1782, it's still binding. It's still being honored. One daughter per generation, married at 14 until there are no more daughters left." I asked her if she thought Elizabeth's daughter, Charlotte's granddaughter, would be safe. Charlotte's smile faded. "Elizabeth doesn't have a daughter," she said. "She has 3 sons. The line is broken." The Pendleton estate was sold in 1995. It's been through 4 owners since then. None of them have stayed longer than 2 years. They all report the same things. Doors that lock themselves, footsteps in empty rooms, the feeling of being watched by something that stands just outside the corner of your vision. The current owner is trying to have it condemned. The last Pendleton daughter was never born. But here's what keeps me awake at night. I found records of other families. Not many, but enough. The Whitfields in South Carolina, the Ashfords in Tennessee, the Coldwells in Maryland. Different names, different estate, but the same pattern. Daughters married at 14. Grooms no one remembers. Families that prosper while their daughters disappear into marriages that look normal from the outside, but feel wrong in ways no one can articulate. I don't know how many families are caught in contracts like this. I don't know what these husbands are or where they come from or what they want. I don't know if the deal can be broken, or if it simply runs its course when there are no more daughters left to fulfill it. What I do know is this: there are things woven into the fabric of American history that we were never meant to see. Agreements made in desperation or greed or fear passed down through generations who didn't understand what they were inheriting. And sometimes the price of prosperity isn't paid all at once. Sometimes it's paid in daughters. One every generation married at 14 to something that wears the shape of a man and exists in the gaps of human memory. The Pendleton line has ended, but I wonder how many others are still paying. If this story disturbed you the way it disturbed me, leave a comment. Tell me if you've heard whispers of families like this in your own town. Tell me if you've seen the wedding portraits where the groom's face won't quite come into focus. Because I don't think the Pendletons were unique.